Navajo Nation via Supernatural Entities. 5 True Horror Stories of the Unexplained. Reservation Memories from Cooley. I was born in the spring of 1989 to a family carrying deep Navajo heritage. Though our home wasn't in the central area of the Navajo Nation, we lived in a smaller portion of reservation land in northern Arizona, where my father's side had resettled decades ago. For reasons they almost never discussed in detail, my father called it a family matter, and that was generally enough to end any questions. Growing up, I took the land for granted. The wide open fields tapering into thick clusters of juniper and pinyon, the mild winters and relentless summer heat, and especially the winding wash that carved a path through the reservation's southern edge. Everything felt like it had been there forever, and I assumed it always would be. In 1999, I turned 10, and that's where this story begins. My memories of this time are unnaturally crisp, likely because those events marked me more deeply than anything else in my childhood. My mother was a firm believer in traditional Navajo teachings. She'd grown up near the Four Corners region. Though we rarely traveled away from our corner of northern Arizona, we still had relatives scattered across several states, but this was where we were settled. My father worked for the tribal council, organizing youth programs and cultural events, while my mother helped run a small convenience store attached to a gas station on the reservation. We weren't wealthy by any stretch, but we weren't desperate either. Life was simple. I had an older sister, Ava, who was 13 at the time, and a younger brother named Peter, who was 5. Our home was a modest, double-wide trailer surrounded by a chain-link fence. Beyond the fence stretched the reservation, a mixture of open fields, scraggly brush, and clusters of trees that some people referred to as the woods, even though they weren't really that dense. There was also a wide arroyo about a quarter-mile from our yard, which filled with water after heavy rains but stayed bone-dry most of the year. Past that arroyo, the land dipped into a shallow valley. You could see for miles if you stood on the slight rise behind our trailer. It was around September 1999 when rumors started to circulate in our small community. People whispered about strange footprints and mutilated animal remains, mostly strays or wild critters found near the edges of the reservation. As rumors often go, nobody took it too seriously at first. Our land has coyotes, and the occasional stray dog pack. I've even heard of mountain lion attacks on animals, though that would be considered very unusual. But the stories we heard didn't match normal predator behavior. Folks said these animals were dismembered in ways that suggested something more deliberate, something that pointed to something beyond natural explanation. The tribal police had no answers. They wrote a few reports, but no culprit was ever found. I didn't worry about it until my father began to lock our gate at night, something he had never bothered to do before. He also insisted we keep our curtains drawn after dark. My mother started to light small juniper bundles and walk around the house, muttering soft prayers in the Navajo language. Ava and I found it curious, but we didn't ask too many questions. Our mother's spiritual side was strong, and sometimes she did these little ceremonies, just because a family member had a bad dream, or because we'd heard of a tragedy in the community. It wasn't entirely unusual, but still, there was a tension in the house that didn't fade. I recall one night, maybe a week after the rumors started, when I heard what I can only describe as scratching sounds on the outside wall near my bedroom window. My window faced the backyard, which led to the fence, and then that open stretch of field. The noise was faint but unmistakable, like nails dragging across metal siding. I froze in terror, but forced myself to listen closely. A few seconds passed. The scratching repeated, slower this time, almost exploratory. I was much too petrified to move. Eventually it stopped, but I lay awake for another hour afterward, waiting for something else to happen. It never did, so I convinced myself it was just a stray cat, or maybe a branch brushing the trailer in the wind. However, my father's behavior the next morning suggested otherwise. I watched him walk the perimeter of our yard, searching the fence line with a flashlight, even though the sun had already risen. He didn't say much, just kept scouring the dirt. When I asked him if something was wrong, he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, grave and heavy with knowledge. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said. "Just be sure to stay in after dark." In October of that year, the rumors intensified. 2 teenage boys from another family claimed they'd seen something stalking them while they walked home from the bus stop at dusk. They described it as a tall figure with uneven proportions, moving on all fours at one point, then standing upright the next. Their parents scolded them for telling wild stories, but the boys insisted on what they saw. I heard about that one in fragments from Ava, who was friends with the older sister of one of those boys. I remember her telling me when no one else was around. They swear it had eyes that glowed orange, not just a reflection, actual light. That detail branded itself into my mind like a hot iron. Around that time, our mother's nightly smudging ritual grew more elaborate. She started to place small pouches of corn pollen near our windowsills and door frames. She taught us a few basic Navajo prayers and insisted we recite them before bed each night. My sister complied, so I followed suit. My younger brother Peter just thought it was a game, but he dutifully repeated the words when prompted. Father, meanwhile, grew quieter than ever. He would return from work and spend his evenings reading old texts or letters that I suspected came from our relatives further inland. He never shared specifics, but I caught glimpses of yellowed pages, possibly referencing stories from our tribal lore. On a cool autumn evening, I got my first direct glimpse of what we were up against. It was near the end of 1999, maybe early November. The nights were chilly, and the sky was clear enough to see countless stars. I was supposed to be asleep, but I'd sneaked out of my bedroom to get a glass of water. Moving through the dark hallway, I passed by a window that looked out onto our front yard. We kept the curtains partially closed, but I could still see outside through the gap. Something was standing by the fence near the gate. At first I thought it was a person, maybe a tall man in a heavy coat. But there was something deeply wrong about the shape. It was slightly hunched, the neck too long, the arms hanging at an odd angle. The figure was just outside the range of our porch light, so I couldn't see its face clearly. It turned its head in a slow, deliberate motion, like it was scanning our windows. I held my breath, my brain screaming that if I made a sound, something terrible would happen. Suddenly, it took a step forward, and the porch light caught part of its shoulder. The color of its skin, or hide, was a patchy blend of gray and brown. No jacket, no recognizable clothing. This wasn't a normal person. My heart hammered against my ribs. The figure sniffed the air, or at least, that's what it looked like. A faint motion of its head, trying to catch a scent. Then it retreated, moving in a fluid but unnatural gait, more like a puppet with partially tangled strings. I watched it vanish into the darkness beyond the fence. Sleep was impossible that night. After seeing that thing, the next morning, I told my sister Ava what I'd seen. She stared at me with wide eyes, asking if that's even possible, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her own fear. We debated whether to tell our parents, eventually deciding to speak to our mother alone. She listened quietly as I described the figure. Instead of dismissing us, she nodded, laying a hand on my shoulder. "It's important not to give too much power to it," she said. "We must protect ourselves with prayer and caution." What she said next was surprising. She told us about ancient beliefs among Navajo people, the existence of certain individuals who could assume animal forms or wear the skins of beasts to move about unseen. She cautioned that these stories were not meant for children, that they dealt with dark forces and forbidden practices. She never used the term that outsiders might use, at least not then, but I recognized enough from rumors I'd heard in fragments over the years. She told us not to speak of it openly, not to even dwell on it, because even thinking about it too much could invite more negativity. She gave us small protective charms to wear, and said we must keep them on at all times. Life continued, albeit with a persistent undercurrent of dread. We still went to school, we still did our chores, but come nightfall, we locked every door and window. The community at large didn't talk about it too openly. A few people mentioned odd sightings, but the older generations simply gave each other knowing glances, as if collectively deciding not to stir the pot. My father coordinated with tribal police, but no official statements were released. It felt like a quiet fear had gripped the reservation, and everyone decided to bear it in silence. As the year 2000 came, not much changed at first. The sightings continued, albeit sporadically. Sometimes a neighbor would wake to find strange footprints around their home, prints that looked somehow human and animal at the same time. A few families reported hearing low chanting at night, drifting across the open land. My mother insisted we never go outdoors after sundown, except in extreme emergencies. We listened. Ava had the hardest time with it because she was used to meeting up with friends in the evenings, but she obeyed. Our father increased his protective measures, sprinkling ashes around our property line on certain nights, and keeping watch until dawn. One evening in March 2000, my father came rushing back into the house, ordering all of us into the living room. He locked the doors, and shut the curtains, and told us to stay absolutely quiet. Through the silence, I heard a series of guttural howls that rose and fell outside, echoing through the darkness like twisted laughter. My brother, Peter, was so scared he started to cry. My mother grabbed him and whispered soothing words in Navajo, urging him to be brave. We huddled together as the house continued, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably around 5 minutes. Then they ceased abruptly. Father told us not to move until morning. The next day we found fresh claw marks on the outside of our front door, deep gouges that splintered the wood. My father pressed his palm over them, his brow furrowed. My mother burned sweet grass and prayed with a seriousness I'd never seen before. Even Ava, who often tried to appear tough, looked pale and shaken. That morning, the realization sank in. This wasn't some random creature passing through. It was something with intent, something that wanted us to know it was there, and it had nearly gotten in. Whether it sought to make us scared, to harm us, or something else entirely, we couldn't say. As time passed, some families decided to leave for a while, staying with relatives in nearby towns, or further across the Navajo Nation. Others stayed, determined not to be driven from their homes. My parents were that type. They refused to go. My father insisted he had obligations to our community, and my mother believed fleeing might empower the entity, giving it dominion over us. But the tension wore on everyone. By late 2000, we were all exhausted from restless nights and constant vigilance. I recall that Ava started to develop nightmares. She would wake up screaming about a dark figure looming over her bed, whispering in a voice she couldn't understand. She spoke of red eyes, not the orange ones those teenage boys had claimed. My mother comforted her with herbal teas and more ceremonies. But Ava's nightmares persisted. She became withdrawn at school, and that concerned her teachers. They suggested counseling, but my parents didn't trust outsiders to handle spiritual matters. In Navajo tradition, sometimes an illness can be more than just physical or mental. It can be spiritual too. So my mother invited a family relative, a respected spiritual practitioner, to visit. This relative arrived in mid-2001. She was an older woman, quiet and composed, who performed a protection ceremony. She sang for hours, using sacred herbs, and praying for our protection. I remember the feeling of warmth that seemed to fill the trailer during her prayers, a sense of relief, even a feeling of a weight lifting off our shoulders. For a short while, things improved. The scratching noises, the howling, the unsettling footprints around the yard, all of it decreased markedly. We found ourselves sleeping more peacefully for a while. But then in early 2002, a new wave of disturbances flared up. It started with an incident involving one of our neighbors, an elderly man who discovered his chicken coop had been torn open late one night. More than a dozen chickens were slaughtered, their remains strewn about in a pattern that defied logic, almost ritualistic. The man was distraught, convinced it was the work of dark forces. Then a high school girl claimed she saw a figure on the roof of the community center at dusk, watching people as they walked to their cars. She described it similarly to what the teenagers had seen before, tall and gaunt, but she added that she saw an animalistic face that made her scream. By the time anyone else looked, though, it was gone. Stories circulated. Some claimed it was a shapeshifter from the old tales, a malevolent force that wore the skins of animals to roam at night. Others thought it might be a person practicing forbidden rituals, conjuring illusions to terrorize the community for reasons unknown. Yet no one could identify who it might be, or why they would target us. Whenever the topic arose, the elders would give grave warnings. Do not speak of it. Don't think about it too much. Protect yourselves, follow the old ways, and be mindful of where you go at night. In the summer of 2002, we had a family gathering. Relatives from out of state visited, and for a brief time, our home was filled with laughter and good food. I almost forgot about the fear that hovered in the background. One evening, my cousin Alec, who was around my age, suggested we go exploring near the arroyo. I hesitated, but decided it would be fine as long as we did so before nightfall. We took Peter with us, and we walked along the dry arroyo bed, searching for interesting rocks. It was nice to feel normal again, just some kids being kids. At a certain point, Alec looked up, and I saw him freeze. I followed his gaze to the crest of a small rise about 50 yards away. A figure stood there. In broad daylight, I could see it more clearly than ever before. Tall, with lanky limbs, its torso wrapped in ragged animal hides. The face was obscured by shadows from the shape of the head covering. Even so, I could sense its eyes on us, cold and unblinking. My stomach churned with terror. I grabbed Peter's hand, and we both retreated a step. Alex stood motionless, mouth agape. Then the figure raised an arm, as if to point at us, or beckon, perhaps both. A sudden dread overcame me, stronger than anything I'd ever felt. We turned and ran, half pulling Peter along, stumbling over the uneven ground. We didn't stop until we made it to our yard, out of breath and trembling. My mother was outside at the time, hanging up laundry. She saw our expressions and immediately ushered us into the house. We explained what happened, tears streaming down Peter's face. Without hesitation, my mother performed another prayer, burning sage, and making sure we drank a special tea to calm our hearts. By 2003, the entire reservation was on edge. People had tried calling state authorities, but the official response was always that they found no evidence of a person or animal that matched our descriptions. No footprints that couldn't be attributed to normal wildlife or known footwear, and no suspicious individuals. It didn't help that many families were hesitant to discuss spiritual beliefs with outsiders. So the cycle continued: sightings, noises, eerie events, followed by periods of uneasy silence. One night in May 2003, I remember my father stepping out onto the porch around midnight. He had his rifle in his hand. He had been hearing a low chanting sound drifting across the fields. After a few minutes, there came the firing of 2 shots into the air. The chanting stopped. My mother was furious that he had resorted to shooting, warning it might provoke something worse. Father, exhausted, just gripped the rifle tight. "We can't just let it roam freely anymore," he told us. "We have to show we can fight back, or it'll never back down." Whether that show of force helped or not, the chanting didn't return for several weeks. We savored that brief calm, though we never lowered our guard. School was a welcome distraction, but even teachers seemed to sense the heaviness that weighed on the community. Students whispered about the entity during lunch breaks, daring each other to go out late at night. Some would joke about it, but those jokes always rang hollow. Beneath the humor lurked genuine fear. When 2004 arrived, I was 14. My sister Ava was 17, preparing for her next steps in life. She wanted to attend college, out of state, far from northern Arizona and its constant dread. She had grown into a quiet but determined young woman, still bearing the psychological scars of her nightmares. Peter was 10 now, a happy child in daylight, but prone to anxious fits once darkness fell. My parents were worn thin. They'd done everything they could to protect us, but years of living under threat was taking its toll. Everyone hoped for resolution soon, a sign that this presence would finally leave. In early spring of that year, my father received word from an elderly relative that there would be a significant ceremony held deeper in the Navajo Nation, a large gathering involving multiple spiritual leaders. It was meant to combat negative forces that had been plaguing several families. My father decided we should participate from afar, hoping a unified spiritual effort would help. Over 3 days, we observed stricter prayers and avoidance rituals. We didn't let Peter watch TV at all. We abstained from certain foods. My mother sang ancient songs I'd never heard before, and I often saw her weep as she did. On the second night of this period, I was awakened by commotion outside. Dogs were barking frantically, and I heard more than one voice shouting. I rushed to the window. In the distant field beyond our fence, flashlights bobbed. At least 3 beams of light swept across the grass. I couldn't see details, but it was clearly a group of men searching for something. A muffled gunshot rang out. My father burst into my room, telling me to stay put. He went outside to join them, carrying his rifle. Later I found out they'd seen the figure, a tall shape loping through the darkness, heading toward the tree line. One of the men fired, but it disappeared. They tracked footprints for 100 yards, footprints that they swore changed shape halfway through, as if human feet gave way to large paw prints. The trail ended abruptly near a rocky outcrop. No blood, no body, nothing. But there was an overpowering stench that made the men recoil. Father came home, looking grim, but with a hint of defiance in his eyes, as if telling me, "We faced it, and we didn't run." That was the last major incident I can remember. Over the next few months, sightings dwindled. Occasional odd noises, or fleeting shapes, yes, but the full-scale terror that had dominated our community began to subside. By the end of 2004, many families breathed easier. Some credited the combined spiritual efforts. Others said it was simply time for the malicious force to move on. And others believed the men that night might have wounded it enough to weaken its hold, even if no blood was found. Nobody knew for certain. For me, that entire stretch of years, from 1999 to 2004, felt like living in a prolonged nightmare. It ebbed and flowed but never entirely released us from its grip. The day I turned 15, I remember my mother quietly saying, "We should be grateful it's calmer now, but never forget what has happened here." She wasn't just talking to me. She was talking to all of us, reminding us to never forget the power of old stories, the reality they hold, even in modern times. She wanted us to remember that there are forces out there that defy logic, and that caution, respect, and spiritual fortitude might be our only defense. Over the years that followed, my family's life stabilized. Ava left for college, returning only during holidays, and seemed to reclaim some of the light-hearted spirit she had lost. Peter grew into a curious teenager,
always asking about those years, but never quite remembering them fully. My mother and father never stopped performing small protective rituals, though they scaled back the intensity once the reservation returned to relative peace. Our old chain link fence around the yard remained, but my father replaced our wooden front door with a sturdier metal one, when he could afford it, still bearing faint scars from the night of the claw marks. Still bearing faint scars from the night of the claw marks. Even though we found a kind of normalcy, the memory of that entity and what it represented has never left me. When I drive through that part of northern Arizona or walk along the Arroyo, I feel a slight chill, recalling the day I saw it in broad daylight. I feel a slight chill, recalling the day I saw it in broad daylight. The elders say that once you've been marked by a supernatural presence, a part of it lingers in your awareness, even if you never see it again. Sometimes I wonder if that presence was truly an external entity, or if some of it came from our own collective fears. But then I remember those unexplainable footprints, the guttural howls, the claw marks on our door, and I know it was more than just imagination.
Night Watcher from FW Faceless. I'm a resident of Kentucky. I've been here all my life. It wasn't very unusual for unsettling things to happen to me, but some of the occurrences confused me and often left me sleepless. One night when I was young, maybe 7 or 8, my brother and I sometimes shared bunk beds. He had them taken apart, so it was 2 twin-size mattresses on each side of the room. I slept on the right side, and my brother slept on the left. I'd always harbored a fear of the dark, not because I can't see, but because you never know what could be lurking in the shadows. This fear was magnified tenfold as a child. I remember that night vividly. My brother had told me he was going to sleep, and we shared our good nights and I love yous. However, I couldn't fall asleep because I'd been up the entire night prior, and slept through most of the day. So, like any child would, I got on my phone, shut off the lamp between my brother and me, and began to watch YouTube, hoping to eventually get drowsy. I remember precisely what I was watching, a video of my favorite YouTuber playing a horror game called Fran Bow. Eventually, my eyes grew heavy, and I passed out. Before that, I made sure to put my phone on the charger. At some point, I woke up in the middle of the night. The lamp was on, and my brother was still asleep. I couldn't quite make sense of everything because I had just awakened, but I remember the light almost blinding me with its intensity. I blinked a few times, regaining my vision, and soon my eyes darted over to the pale, emaciated, diminutive entity that had perched itself on the edge of my brother's bed. I made eye contact with it. The arms seemed to have no muscles whatsoever. The thing didn't even have a mouth. Just 2 tiny dots for nostrils and enormous hollow black eyes that seemed to absorb all light that entered them. When I began to sit up, the entity scurried over to my side of the room, but instead of going on to the edge of my bed, it slithered beneath it. I froze in terror, unsure of what to do or say. I wanted to wake my brother, but I couldn't move a muscle. I lay back down, shut the lamp off, and somehow managed to fall back asleep. How did I manage to do that? I'm not sure. I was a fearless and cocky kid back then, and still need sleep, so I guess that's how. Even though I thought it was safe to return to slumber, I was jolted awake again with the lamp on. However, this time, it was as though I'd been struck with sleep paralysis. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything. And that very same entity sat on the edge of my bed, staring down at me with those bottomless eyes. I wanted to push, shove, kick, scream or cry, anything, but I was completely immobilized. I genuinely believed I was about to die. I didn't know what to do. I began to panic internally, but there was nothing I could do physically. The entity just observed me, as if contemplating how to consume me whole like I was its midnight feast. I frantically cycled through every possible terrible outcome in my mind, but nothing happened. It seemed like I'd fallen back asleep, but I immediately woke up again. Everything was normal, just as I'd left it. The lamp was off, my brother was sleeping, and most importantly, there was no pale entity anywhere to be seen. I quickly got up anyway, checking underneath our beds, searching through the closet, bathroom, the entire house, literally everywhere. I couldn't even process what had happened to me, so I just pushed it aside and moved on. For a few years, I'm older now, and occasionally reflect on this encounter. I've had people share similar stories about this type of entity. Some even compare it to an infamous legend called the Rake. I wasn't convinced, but I researched it, and there were disturbing similarities. Still, I dismissed it, hoping it was inconsequential. Around ages 7 or 8, I started to wet the bed. It was humiliating, and I had no explanation for why it was happening. I was certainly old enough to control my bladder. A few months later, I was preparing for bed one night, but this time in my own room. I had a twin-sized bed, positioned right next to my door. I got comfortable, took a deep breath, had my TV on, and eventually drifted off. But then something woke me. That same entity was there, this time seated right beside my head, watching me. I couldn't move or speak, just like before. Though it lacked a mouth, I somehow heard it speak. Something I can't precisely recall, but I know it was some sort of threat or warning. After that encounter, I actually stopped wetting the bed, and the entity never appeared to me again. I told my family about the experience, but they dismissed it as a child's overactive imagination. To this day, I remain bewildered by it, and have no explanation for the phenomenon. The important lesson I would take away is to always triple-check everything before you lie down to sleep. You never know what might be lurking in your home. Something was going on at that farm from Tegale 921. The collection of strange events I'm about to recount about a farm my family once owned may not be the most terrifying tales of malevolent spirits or creatures, but they are 100% true, though it's important to note that these occurrences didn't happen only to me but to several people whose stories I'll share to the best of my knowledge. First, I should describe the farm where these events transpired. Located in the more rural areas of northwestern Colombia, my family owned a sizable property near a mid-sized town. Though the buildings weren't particularly large, the land was vast, extending from the main road into the upper outskirts of the town, consisting of either grass fields for grazing or small patches of native forest. It wasn't an isolated place by any means. Communication with both the road and town was easy, and we had relatively close neighbors. For the most part, it was a lovely place when we were children, and whenever we visited, my sister, friends who occasionally came along, and I would play all day. However, when nightfall came, we all agreed there was something profoundly unsettling about the way darkness enveloped the farm. It would always feel impenetrably black outside, even when the moon was out. This may sound like childish exaggeration, but it genuinely felt that way. In fact, every time we promised ourselves we'd go camping in the fields just for fun at night, we would inevitably lose our nerve when the sun set and rush back to the farm building. The true uneasiness of the farm began with two particular incidents. One happened to me, and another to a friend. They occurred close in date, because my friend, I'll call him Ben, was staying at the farm then. One night, Ben couldn't sleep. Around midnight, he decided to walk to a small set of stables near the main farm building. The stable lights were always on, so when he approached and looked inside at the horses, he witnessed something that chilled him to his core. There he saw a horse's tail being braided, but when he looked to see who was doing it, there was no one there. The tail was seemingly being braided by invisible hands. He stared in disbelief for several moments before quickly returning to bed, deeply disturbed for the remainder of the night. The next morning, he recounted this experience. Though my sister and I didn't dwell on it much initially, it lingered in our minds throughout the day. What I didn't realize was that the next incident would come uncomfortably close to me. A few nights later, as I slept, around 3 a.m., I heard heavy footsteps outside my window. Being a light sleeper, I awakened immediately, but thought nothing of it at first, keeping my eyes closed. However, the footsteps continued, and from what I could discern, whatever was making them appeared to be circling my window. My heart pounded violently, but I still didn't open my eyes. Suddenly, the footsteps halted directly outside my window. I could now faintly detect a heavy guttural breathing or snorting sound, as if something was standing and observing me through the glass. My heart raced uncontrollably. I was completely paralyzed. Either I couldn't open my eyes, or I refused to, fearing that if I did, I would behold something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Instead, I remained motionless and silent. After what felt like an eternity, perhaps 20 minutes, the footsteps resumed. The breathing ceased, and gradually, the heavy thuds receded toward a nearby forest patch, leading to another property. After that experience, I couldn't sleep properly for the remainder of our stay. When I asked Ben the next day if he or anyone else had been near my window at that hour, he replied that no one had risen before 6 a.m. Of course, this wouldn't be the last peculiar occurrence. Years later, my sister was outside playing with 2 friends when suddenly 4 silhouettes began moving toward the farm gate. It's important to note that the gate is a large structure that completely blocks visibility, except for one's lower legs. My sister observed 4 figures, all wearing white robes that reached their feet, approaching the gate in perfect synchronization. They walked to the gate, turned to face it simultaneously, then turned again and continued walking in the same eerie, coordinated manner. The incident made her profoundly uneasy, and she quickly returned to the main building. Though it wasn't uncommon to see people pass by the gate, since it faced the main road, the way these figures moved seemed mechanically synchronized, maintaining perfect spacing between them. Other, less direct but equally disturbing incidents occurred. Once, we found an armadillo that appeared to have been methodically dissected in one of the grass fields. We initially blamed wild dogs, but even that explanation felt insufficient, especially since we'd never heard wild dog packs in the vicinity. Another strange sighting came from a worker who arrived at the farm around 5 a.m. and claimed to have seen what he described as a monkey, a short primate-like creature with pure white fur running on its hind legs at remarkable speed from one forest patch to another. I'm not extensively familiar with monkey species, but most New World primates don't run upright on their hind legs, especially not for distances of at least 100 meters. And certainly not at speeds suggesting a naturally bipedal organism. What confuses me most is that these experiences seem disconnected. There doesn't appear to be a single entity responsible, if one wants to use that terminology. Some theories I've considered involve a native burial ground discovered beside the farm building, which remained undisturbed. But who knows what it contained? Perhaps the remains of a powerful shaman. Could that explain phenomena like the horse's hair being braided? Personally, I think it goes beyond that simple explanation. As I mentioned earlier, there was something inherently disquieting about nightfall at that farm. Nothing was visibly wrong, but the darkness itself felt unnatural, even if that sounds like childhood fancy. Even now, though I consider myself relatively skeptical, I often reflect on the occurrences at that farm whenever I hear others' inexplicable stories. It's entirely possible these events were products of imagination. Children are certainly more susceptible to fear. But I suspect that even now, if I returned to that farm, I would still feel that unnerving presence after dark, and I would absolutely refuse to camp in those fields. The Aurora Borealis from Wickeder Orc 5434. A few months ago, when the Aurora Borealis was predicted to be visible in my region, I decided to embark on a small road trip with my cousin and aunt. We prepared at their house and departed around 12:30 a.m. The journey felt longer than it actually was. We entertained ourselves by playing music as we drove. The landscape surrounding us consisted of vast fields of tumbleweed and rocky terrain, with no signs of civilization for miles. I still love visiting that area even now. This setting was perfect for viewing the Aurora Borealis. We were in the southwestern part of Idaho bordering northern Nevada. The weather was mild, but a slight breeze created a cooler atmosphere. The absolute darkness outside contributed to an unsettling ambiance. We had explored various locations in that area before. Camping out there, staying overnight in my aunt's car, searching for unusual phenomena, hiking and exploring caves, even visiting small-town thrift shops some distance away. My aunt was somewhat familiar with the surroundings, though my cousin and I weren't adept at navigating the area. We rarely used maps or navigation tools, yet we'd visited numerous times. Around 2:30 a.m., we reached a suitable location to stop. My cousin had fallen asleep, leaving my aunt and me alone and awake. We parked on the roadside, adjacent to a precipitous drop. Half of the car, the side where my cousin was sleeping in the front left seat, faced the edge of the cliff, while I sat in the back right seat, oriented toward the road. After taking photos for a few minutes, we began to hear a sound that gradually intensified the longer we remained there. It was like someone attempting to hum a melody without ever having heard music before. The tone seemed simultaneously masculine and feminine. I struggled to describe it precisely, but it evoked an eerie sense of familiarity, though I couldn't identify its origin. The sound appeared to emanate from my cousin's side of the car, the side facing the cliff edge. My aunt initially thought I was making the noise, repeatedly asking, "What?" However, I was confused because I believed she was the source of the sound. When she heard me respond with "What?" simultaneously as the voice continued, she urgently commanded me to get into the car immediately. She accelerated away while my car door remained open, my legs still dangling outside. Whatever produced that sound was clearly no ordinary animal or human. In Idaho folklore, there are legends of diminutive humanoid entities that prey on people, called the Nimegar. Some say they sometimes sing, their voices echoing through the mountains. My issue with this theory is that these legends are centered in a different part of Idaho. My aunt believes it was an ancient shape-shifting entity. My cousin dismisses our concerns, suggesting it was probably just some animal. The more I reflect on this experience, the less certain I am about what we encountered that night. The Witch of the Maine Woods. From S. Scar. I was a junior at the University of Maine when this happened. About 8 years ago. 2 friends and I, Charlotte and Isaac, decided to rent an inexpensive cabin near a small town called Glover's Creek to unwind for a long weekend. We selected that area because we'd heard rumors of a forest spirit from colonial times. We weren't truly believers, but we enjoyed exploring local legends. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The cabin belonged to a man named Mr. Baines, who was notably reticent when we arrived. He simply handed us the key, observed us unloading our car, and departed. The place was aged, with worn floorboards and a musty odor. It had 2 bedrooms, a cramped kitchen, and a living area barely large enough for the 3 of us. Still, it seemed adequate for a brief stay. After settling in, we drove into town for supplies. Glover's Creek was tiny, just a diner, a general store, and a small library. At the library, an older librarian greeted us politely, showing curiosity about 3 college students passing through. Charlotte inquired if there were any local ghost stories or interesting historical accounts in the area. The librarian paused thoughtfully before mentioning that locals sometimes spoke of a woman who supposedly vanished in the woods centuries ago. Some residents believed her spirit wandered a swamp in the forest preserve, calling out in the night. The librarian offered little additional information, so we thanked her and left. That evening we discussed the story in the cabin. Charlotte was enthusiastic and eager to investigate. Isaac was more cautious, though he admitted interest in the legend but emphasized safety. We decided to visit this swamp the following day, and perhaps stay a few hours after nightfall. On Saturday we drove down a dirt road into the forest preserve. The trees grew denser as we progressed, and the air felt heavy with moisture. Eventually we reached an area where the ground became muddy. We parked in a small clearing and hiked a narrow path, carefully stepping over roots and avoiding soft patches of earth. Soon we arrived at a swampy area, still water surrounded by tall reeds and moss-covered logs. The place was unnaturally silent, with barely any wildlife sounds. We stood at the water's edge. Charlotte tossed a pebble to gauge its depth, and ripples spread across the surface. Isaac suggested returning later with a fire or lantern, thinking we might witness something if the ghost story held truth. We all agreed to return at dusk, so we left to gather supplies. Around sunset we returned with a small camp lantern, snacks and extra clothing. We established a basic site near the swamp, though we didn't plan on sleeping there. The temperature dropped rapidly. We huddled around a makeshift fire pit, trying to avoid the smoke as we talked about college, made jokes and occasionally directed our flashlights at the dark water. Near midnight we heard a splash from somewhere in the swamp. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. Isaac aimed his flashlight in that direction, but the beam revealed nothing except more reeds. The swamp's surface rippled slightly. We remained silent for several moments, waiting for a recurrence. Then there was another splash, followed by a faint sound I can only describe as a soft moan or sigh. Charlotte whispered, "Did you hear that?" And we both nodded. We extinguished the flashlight and waited in darkness. That's when something materialized above the water, a faint luminescence, roughly human-shaped, standing upright. It hovered above the water's surface, not on solid ground. We couldn't discern facial features or details, just the silhouette of a figure swaying gently back and forth. The three of us froze in place. Charlotte clutched my wrist, and Isaac stared transfixed. My heart thundered against my ribs. I wasn't sure if this was some optical illusion or something beyond natural explanation. Then we heard the moaning sound again, originating from that glowing apparition. It wasn't loud, but it seemed deliberate, almost like someone attempting to speak but failing. We felt an unnatural chill in the air that didn't match the typical nighttime temperature of the region. After approximately a minute, the figure dissolved like mist dispersing. We remained in silence, as if expecting its return, but nothing further occurred. The water's surface returned to stillness. Charlotte whispered, "Let's leave," and Isaac agreed immediately. I felt the same urgent need to depart. We hastily gathered our belongings, extinguished the fire with water, and navigated back along the trail. The walk to the car was tense. Every small sound made me flinch. We didn't speak until we were all inside the car with the doors secured. Isaac drove us back to the cabin, maintaining silence the entire journey. That night, none of us slept well. We left all lights burning in the cabin. Charlotte wanted to process what we'd witnessed, but Isaac and I couldn't articulate an explanation. I suggested it might be some natural phenomenon, swamp gas or methane bubbles, but the distinct humanoid shape and that haunting moan felt far too real to dismiss. By morning, we'd collectively decided to end our trip prematurely. We packed our belongings, cleaned the cabin, and left a brief note for Mr. Baines, explaining our early departure. On the drive home, we were each lost in our thoughts, processing what we'd experienced. And that's how we became believers in the Witch of Maine. How would you deal with a malevolent entity problem that persisted for years? Confront it directly with force, or rely on prayer and protection, while pretending it doesn't exist? Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails, and you should follow me on X at Dark Prevails, where I recently shared a fascinating prehistoric discovery that you'll want to see. Send me your chilling stories at darkstories.org. Sign up for membership at EerieCast. Come Plus for exclusive content, and help us become the most spine-tingling show in existence by following and reviewing Unexplained Encounters on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.